Okay, welcome to the second panel today.
Yeah, I think there's a thing about it in academic lawyers.
We'll be talking about the Clean Power Plan and beyond, what's in store for the future of U.S. climate policy, what's the potential for the U.S. to continue to make progress in reducing greenhouse gases, is there a potential for future federal action or inaction, and what might happen in spite of federal action or inaction. Joining me here on the panel, very honored to be joined by Dr. Sue Tierney. She is Senior Advisor with the Analysis Group. She's an expert on energy policy and economics. Formerly, she was Assistant Secretary for Policy for the Department of Energy. To her right is Arvin Ganesan, VP of Federal Policy for Advanced Energy Economy, where he advocates to Congress and the executive branch for energy innovation and advanced energy technologies. Formerly, he was Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy at EPA. And Phil Schiliro, Managing Director of Schiliro Barnett, a consulting firm that specializes in helping nonprofits navigate the world of public policy. He's spent more than 30 years in Congress, working for Congress, working for the White House, including as White House Director of Legislative Affairs. So I'm just going to take a minute to go over some background to set up their presentations, starting with what is the state of play, what exists in terms of federal regulations right now that the Obama administration has been working on the last 8 years. So the biggest ticket item is electricity generation. The Obama administration has issued two key rules here: the Clean Power Plan that regulates existing power plants, and new source performance standards for new coal and gas power plants. The Clean Power Plan depends on state implementation. The new source standards largely follows the market in that most projections for plants that will be built in the future, natural gas plants, already comply with the rule. Both of these rules are under litigation right now. And as I mentioned, the Clean Power Plan depends on state implementation. We're still waiting for model trading rules from EPA to give the states guidance. Those are still pending. They might be finalized before the end of the Obama administration. EPA has also taken some action with regard to methane, rules for new oil and gas sources and for new and existing landfills. You also heard David Hayes mention that BLM standards for onshore federal and oil and gas leases, their methane emissions, are perhaps being finalized even as we speak. The Supreme Court has upheld one class of regulation on large stationary sources. It's called BACT, or Best Available Control Technology. It's not exactly toothless, but it has relatively few teeth. These are local case-by-case determinations. Mostly to date, what they require is energy efficiency measures. The first thing the Obama administration did on climate change, the first big thing they did was mobile source standards for fuel efficiency for cars. They've also done it for trucks. Originally, industry was very much on board with these policies. Now, perhaps there are rumors that they are souring on that. There's also the renewable fuel standard requirements for ethanol and such that maybe provide some coverage for the emissions from existing mobile sources. However, as Peter Lehner pointed out, there's a lot of debate over that. There's a lot of reasons to think that corn to ethanol is maybe completely counterproductive to climate change. EPA started the process towards regulating emissions from aircraft. That remains incomplete, and it's almost certainly going to remain incomplete by the end of the Obama administration. DOE, Department of Energy, has been very active. Dozens and dozens of energy efficiency rules, EP has some regulations for HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. These are very potent greenhouse gases. And last but not least, there's a federal policy of using the global social cost of greenhouse gases in regulatory impact analyses and in environmental impact statements. So when the government takes action, they have to at least look at the climate effects, measure them, and weigh them in the costs and benefits. As Ricky alluded to in his opening, use of the global social cost of carbon has been upheld by the Seventh Circuit, but now the future is perhaps uncertain. The U.S. has made various international commitments, along with nearly 200 countries, under the auspices of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We made a commitment under what's called the Paris Agreement to reduce 26 to 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions from a baseline by the year 2025. Recently, there's the Kigali Agreement on hydrofluorocarbons, those very potent greenhouse gases. It's under the Montreal Protocol. Developed countries are committed to at least 80% reductions by 2050, and there's a financing mechanism to be hashed out in the future to provide assistance to developing countries. There's also the International Civil Aviation Organization's program for controlling emissions from international aviation, mitigating levels beyond 2020. The U.S. is also committed to that, but the future remains uncertain. The next two slides, and my last two slides, show that even with our pre-election trajectory, we still had a long way to go to reach the U.S. commitments, the international commitments. This shows the U.S., it's called the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution. This is our pledge under the Paris Agreement. The gap there gives you a sense of how far we have to go. And we have even further to go if we're to try to actually stabilize the climate at a 2-degree increase. This is a rating based on Climate Action Tracker. So that's where we stand now. The question for the panelists is going to be, what does the future hold? Are there areas where climate advocates can still work with the next administration? Are there areas where the U.S. can continue to make progress even without the support of a presidential administration? And how might Congress react to all of this? So we'll start off with a talk from Sue.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Ricky, for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here and talking to a group of people who are interested in policy integrity. So that's really nice. We have to keep our chin up. And in that, I just want to start by paying homage to what I hope is an award-winning thing out of New York City. Didn't you love that Kate McKinnon Hallelujah song? So remember, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. Wow, she was so amazing. So she said, I did my best. I've told the truth. I didn't come to fool you. And even though it all went wrong, I won't give up, nor should you. So that's kind of the theme of my desperately hoped-for optimistic set of comments here today. So the title of mine and our panel was the Clean Power Plan and Beyond. And so remember, the Clean Power Plan is about the power sector in the United States and reducing carbon dioxide emissions. I am not a lawyer. Thanks to Tomas over there, I got to participate in some of the litigation surrounding the Clean Power Plan in favor of its retention, by the way. But I don't know what's going to happen to that. Obviously, we don't know who's going to be on the Supreme Court when the thing gets there or anything else. So I'm not going to prognosticate about the Clean Power Plan, but I'm going to talk about carbon emissions from the power sector and why I think it might be okay and not as bad as we think, or some of us think. So many of you don't know me, and so let me just describe myself. I'm a hopeless policy wonk. That's what I spend all my time doing, and I have worked for state and federal governments, worked for a variety of different kinds of institutions professionally, spend really my time today on clean energy. My time today, in other words, on the rest of the time that I'm on the planet, on clean energy. I have 2 sons, so I definitely care about this both in my head and my heart. So I'm also a principled pragmatist, which is why I'm going to talk about some fundamental things that are going on, whether or not the Supreme Court doesn't uphold the Clean Power Plan, or whether or not it's yanked back or anything else. So I'm going to talk about market fundamentals, and by that I mean what's going on in our energy markets. I'm going to try to stay away from the topics that the third panel is going to talk about, but why some of the things going on in the energy markets are leading in the direction of a lower carbon footprint from the power sector. I'm going to talk about state action, and I'll just spend some more time on that, and then private action on lowering carbon emissions from the power sector. Because the punchline of all of that is a lot of sustained direction in favor of a lower carbon footprint. Those things that I just described are not enough. They're definitely not enough, and so people have their work cut out for them continuing, whether or not there had been a change in expectations about who would be in Washington. There still has to be a whole lot to be done, but there's still some things happening. So I'm actually going to skip ahead to this slide first. This is a picture over the last 30 years of the mix of power resources that generate electricity in the United States. So 1985 on your left, the current year, last year on your right. And you'll see something happened around 2008, which is where the coal industry, the coal portion of the power generation mix began to drop. Now, the rhetoric in Washington is that was the war on coal. That is not what happened. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what happened to cause that declining share of the mix. See, in 2008, coal generated about half of the power in the United States. Big footprint from carbon emissions from the power sector. Natural gas was half of that sector. And you'll see that those other renewables up there in that tiny little corner on the right-hand side were not even hardly showing up 10 years ago. So a lot of things have changed over these 30 years. Now I'm going to back up for a sec. I'm going to keep you in suspense about that one. But, ooh, I can't get off of it. Oh, no. How do you move back when you're pushing the backward sign and it's not moving? I'm really sorry. Well, this is really a punchline slide, so you can memorize this for a sec. Oh, the keyboard. Oh, a keyboard. I can do that, a keyboard. So those of you who like charts and graphs and are not lawyers, so this is a picture of the change in coal and gas prices since 2008, that same 10-year period, almost 10-year period. And if you are below the line, prices have gone down. If you're above the line, prices have gone up since 2008. Coal is above the line in that red line. And you can see that they have been sustained up above the prices that they were in 2008. And you can see, except for very spiky periods, around, I think, 2014, I think it was the polar vortex. Paul, is that about right? We saw a spike in gas prices for sure, but gas prices have been down consistently. Now, ooh, I better use this. This is a picture of what's happened in the coal industry. Anybody interested in reading 25 pages about what happened to our poor coal industry in the United States? I just published a report on this and would be happy to send it to you if you're interested. But the punchline here is, if you look at productivity in mining, that's that picture on the right. Productivity in mining coal peaked in the year 2000. It had been gaining in terms of the output per worker in Wyoming, in Appalachia, in central United States. And that peaked because of fundamental problems in the way that coal mining processes were being deployed. Mining, there was a rush to start getting as much coal out as possible to meet international demand. And as a result, we have seen consistently lower productivity in mining. Not a good thing to forecast a renaissance of the coal industry in the United States. So that is particularly harsh in poor Wyoming, where I actually feel sorry for a lot of people because their economy is so dependent upon coal and coal royalties. But you can see these other two pictures are also part of the same story. The top one is production. And you can see starting again in the year 2000, Wyoming cleaned the clocks of Appalachia and central United States in terms of total tons of coal produced. And everybody's declining right now. And if you think that the war on coal that the Obama administration did, led to the reduction in coal mining employment, start looking at, again, 1985, all the way down in terms of today's total employment in the coal mining industry in the United States. This has been a gradual decline associated with, for a while, increased productivity and then decreased productivity, drop in demand from the power sector. The power sector is 90 to 95% of U.S. coal supply goes to the U.S. power sector. So if the U.S. power sector is being eaten alive by low natural gas prices, then flat demand for electricity, bad productivity in the coal mining sector, a trapped supply and demand situation here in the United States, plus international demand for coal being collapsing in the last few years. Okay, so it was not a war on coal except what the coal industry did, basically, is my punchline on that one. So, one more thing about the context. This is a picture of, during my lifetime, you can see exactly how old I am, from around 1950 to today, the introduction each year of the amount of generating capacity added to the US fleet by type of technology. And the important thing that I want to show you is brown here is natural gas capacity. And you see starting in the year 2000, gas-fired generating capacity was cheap compared to other things. And you don't see much coal coming online in the last few years. The coal plants, which here are in dark navy blue, stopped coming into the market, high capital cost, and now uneconomic relative to natural gas. Though we saw a very aging fleet of generating capacity on coal, and of course, probably about a sixth of the coal-fired generating capacity retiring in the past few years. And those were old Eisenhower era capacity like I am. And so they're retiring off the scene. I'm not retiring yet, though. Another piece of context is what's been happening to renewable supply also. So this is wind capacity and solar capacity since the year 2000, and you just see, this is the installed capacity cumulatively as you see going forward, just an increase of 40-fold in terms of solar capacity. And I don't quite remember what it is, but something like 10-fold in wind capacity. So that is creating a lot of generation all over the country, including in rural areas in red states. And so there's a lot of jobs in localities where people find renewable energy attractive for not only environmental reasons, but also for economic development regions in the states. This is a function, too, of the declining costs of the technology itself, the continuation of federal subsidies through the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, which now I think are set to expire several years from now, so we're likely to see a continuation of support there. So renewables are growing, and they are very popular all over the country, not just in blue states. So I know that line looks like a snake, and it looks like it's curving, but blur your eyes and try to think about kind of the central tendency of that curve. And the central tendency of the Henry Hub natural gas price forwards is it's pretty flat. So Henry Hub is the benchmark in the eastern side of the United States for pricing natural gas. A forward is something that you could buy today for delivery in a future year. You can buy gas pretty much for the future at today's prices, and they are rock bottom. So we have a huge domestic supply of gas. It would really surprise me if the Trump administration, however hard it is for me to say that, does something to constrain the supply of gas and the production of natural gas. Now, that would be a shocker of all proportion. Additionally, states' policies significantly drive natural extraction of oil and gas. So as a result of this, this is pretty flat natural gas, meaning that coal is going to have a hard time coming back no matter what Donald Trump thinks he said he's going to do on the campaign swing. And renewables are going to be eating into the supply into the portion of the electric system that is fueled by something besides natural gas and by coal. Couple more pieces of context looking forward. So these are all maps. I want you to envision that county map of the election. And you can remember that there's a huge chunk of the United States in the middle that is red. And these are maps that have renewable resource potential. And if it's a dark color, it means there's a lot. So again, you can blur your eyes basically to make the point that if it's local jobs, local economic development, and also lower carbon emissions and a sustainable energy system, there's a lot of interest in the middle of the country, including from state policies, to support and deploy these natural resources. These are domestic resources, and there's a lot of signs pointing that over the next 4 years, there will be continued development of them. There will probably be a challenge in the development of interstate infrastructure. I kind of ascribe to the view that people's attitudes about protecting their backyards from pipelines and frankly from transmission lines are not going to change. It will still be hard to develop interstate infrastructure. The federal government doesn't control the siting of electric transmission lines across interstate lines. That's a matter of state policy. The federal government does do natural gas and oil pipelines, but I still think there's going to be a lot of people who are protesting, and they will be using the courts, I believe, about that infrastructure. So state policy. These are just a couple of other maps that you can just picture why I think the punchline is for state policies, there'll be continued push for renewables. So if you are a green state on the top left map, you have a renewable target as a matter of law that your electricity utilities have to include an increasing blend of renewables as part of what you sell to customers. So that's everywhere, pretty much everywhere around the country. And the bottom right is an even more granular carve-out that state policies have for developing solar resources in their backyard. Now remember, it's hard to develop solar resources for transport across the interstate system. I mean, those tend to be local, in-state things that people are doing. They have withstood the Commerce Clause on this in some states, but nonetheless, there's a lot of local development in a lot of different parts of the country. Again, just blur your eyes to see the point. On the top left, those are states that have adopted a climate action plan. They're in a lot of different parts of the country. On the top right, those are the states that have, as a matter of law, adopted a greenhouse gas reduction target for their economies or portions of it. The bottom left are places where the states have adopted efficiency standards as a tool through which investments in the electric sector are loaded in after energy efficiency investments. And then finally, again, alternative and renewable energy at the bottom right. And all over the country, I do not expect you to read these little things, but you can look at them later on just for your heart's desire. There is so much activity going on all over the country in terms of the changing character of the power system, that those things are being driven by state action and state policies. I don't see any of those things changing. I was out at NARUC yesterday in California, and the issues that are hot are pretty much the same issues that were hot a week ago Monday as they are today, and that's because these are driven by state policy, by market fundamentals, and by customer preferences in a lot of instances. I'm almost done. Recall that one of the things that happened in Paris in December was that a number of companies stood up around the world and said, we are going to take action of our own. Cities did that too. But I happen to put up here the number of companies that on the left have signed up to 100% renewable targets. These are some of the US companies that have done that. They've chosen different years in which they aspire to do that. Some of the Silicon Valley companies have already gotten there in terms of their worldwide fleet of electricity, a fleet of installations that use electricity and that are relying on renewable energy. But these are ones that are leading the way, and I think that's not going to change after Tuesday's election. The ones on the right reflect companies that have signed up for long-term purchase power agreements with renewables, nothing to do with state policies, everything to do with wanting to control their electricity and keep prices stable. Of course, there's branding about being a clean company as part of that, but the buzz is of those companies on the right, they are very interested in controlling and managing their electricity bills, and they felt that doing that with renewables would help them. So now you just get to look at my little sign off there. So in spite of the fact that I think there's so much momentum moving in the direction of the Clean Power Plan, I think that most estimates say that the targets for each state to clean up its local power supply would be met without the Clean Power Plan because of the things that I just described. We won't have the same enforcement coming out, so that's one thing that's different. Also, I worry about, of course, what's the next step beyond this in terms of the climate commitments, but also I worry about the optics internationally about subnational action and private action being so much the bedrock of our nationally determined commitments in the absence of a Clean Power Plan. So a lot of the other countries also have subnational action. None of them have enforcements against them either in terms of the structure of the agreement. But there is, so I think that telling the story about why even if the Clean Power Plan somehow doesn't survive through this, telling the story about how there is momentum in the ocean of the markets, state policy, and private action, I think is an important narrative. And see, I really tried to be optimistic. That's it.
That was pretty optimistic.
Good.
I didn't hear the last part. What did you say? Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ricky, for inviting me. I'm Arvin Ganesan. I run federal policy for Advanced Energy Economy. Advanced Energy Economy is a trade association of companies that make what we call advanced energy. So this ranges from renewable energy to energy efficiency to all of the technologies that are coming online to improve our energy system and have a benefit of decarbonizing the system as well. These names of our members are ones that are very recognizable. They range in the tech sector from companies like Apple and Facebook to many, many different types of solar and wind companies and a whole host of energy efficiency companies. So prior to this position, I was an advisor to current EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy and was also an advisor to the previous EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. So I wanted to wrap in some of these perspectives, both the technology perspective as well as some of the regulatory background into my remarks. And as I was telling some of you, I was on the fence as early as 15 minutes ago as whether I should be optimistic or dour or just tell some jokes.
Or sing a song.
Or sing a song, but I decided not to subject you to the latter two. What I thought that there's a couple of brief points I would make and end my remarks relatively quickly. Sue actually said in a much more eloquent way many of the points I wanted to highlight on market transformation and market trends. But I want to talk specifically about carbon regulation of the electricity sector. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of facts. The Clean Power Plan is the Obama administration's approach to regulating carbon dioxide from power plants. It is being litigated right now, and we know that the Trump administration has, the office of the campaign of Mr. Trump has said that they want to withdraw the Clean Power Plan. That's actually all we know at this point. There's a lot that's unwritten about what the future of the Trump administration will look like, and while it's easy in some regards to prognosticate about what that looks like, I actually think that the epilogue on his administration has not been written, let alone the prologue of it. So I urge, let's take this one step at a time as we think about the actions that are going to happen over the next 4 years. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the lawsuit and the process of withdrawing a rule, aside from saying this. Specifically on the withdrawal of a rule, if that's the direction that takes place, that is not straightforward. It requires a pretty robust legal argument as to why the existing rule ought to be withdrawn. It's subject to notice and comment, and it's subject to judicial review. I'm not saying that that's not impossible. In fact, good lawyers can at EPA can probably make that happen, but it's not a simple process to navigate, and one that could take significant amounts of time. So while all that is being considered, a couple other points to remember. The underlying regulatory obligation of EPA to regulate CO2 is unchanged. As everybody knows, in Mass v. EPA, the Supreme Court said that if EPA determines that any pollutant endangers public health or welfare, that it is subject to the various regulatory requirements of the Clean Air Act. In 2009, EPA went through a very, very complicated and detailed rulemaking with the IPCC report at the time, in addition to other documents being the basis for the determination that greenhouse gases do endanger public health and welfare. So absent whatever happens with the Clean Power Plan, that regulatory requirement stays in place. So there's two ways to deal with this. Number one, it's funny how I'm prognosticating after I said we shouldn't prognosticate. There was my joke, Sue. There's two ways that the Trump administration could deal with this. They could withdraw the rule, as described before, or they could remove the legal obligation to act on carbon dioxide by essentially promulgating another rulemaking invalidating the endangerment finding. This is a very, in my opinion, very difficult threshold to pass. You need to argue not only should EPA not regulate CO2, but that the scientific and legal record that was amassed in the endangerment finding is no longer correct, which is a very difficult threshold to consider, but one of the options that the Trump administration may have to address this issue that they want to deal with. So I take some solace in the fact that the obligation still exists. The other point on Clean Power Plan specifically is, from our perspective, as a group that represents technology, the Clean Power Plan, as Sue said, is not a long-term solution. It's a codification of the trends that we have seen in the electricity system for the last 5 to 10 years. There has been a desire for an electric sector that incorporates more sources, that is more resilient and more flexible. And I think that is why our companies have been able to sell to utilities even during this time of a judicial stay. So from that perspective, we feel that the trend lines and the market lines for technologies like ours, which have many co-benefits that we can talk about, those still stay in place. We still have an electricity system that is actually woefully unreliable. given our status in the world, there's this great chart that I wish I put together of the amount of money we spend on transmission and the amount of reliability as defined by outages that exists. It's not great. And as you juxtapose that with the need and demand for reliable energy, it's major. If you're a data center, and increasingly we rely on data centers for, not just going to hotmail.com or whatever, but all sorts of applications, right? I can turn on my security system or my thermostat through this. So need for reliable data is so important. And we've seen just over the last couple years, for 1 minute of outages of a data center, the cost to that operator is about $8,000 a minute. So the need for reliable energy is more pronounced now than it's ever been. And these technologies that represent so many things, including decarbonization and many other benefits, those are the ones that lead to a more reliable energy system. So for many reasons, including those, the market demand for these technologies will exist. Now, is that a regulatory way to get these benefits, get these reductions? No. But I feel optimistic in the markets, and I feel optimistic that consumers, which is the next point that I'm going to make in a second, are going to increasingly demand these technologies. As Sue said, there are 71% of the Fortune 100 have clean energy or sustainability goals. Over 50% of all the PPAs, the power purchase agreements, were done with wind, and they were done with many in the tech sector. There is a demand for many of these large corporate consumers to not only purchase the electricity that they want and their customers want, and they want for reliability purposes, but more importantly, they want to procure it themselves. They don't want to go increasingly through a utility-controlled system that provides electricity to various consumers. And so this gets to one of the final points I want to make about trends in the system and why there's reason for optimism. This is not an environmental law question, but it's an electricity law question, and we're going to hear experts talk about this on the next panel. But the underlying business model that utilities have used for centuries is starting to feel pressure. And that business model relies on centralized generation, guaranteed rates of return, and a slower curve for adopting technologies than one that allows for different technologies to participate in the electricity system. That underlying compact, even trade groups representing the utilities would argue, is starting to feel pressure. And that is why technology is going to be able to get to market faster over the next 10 years than it did over the current 10 years, which was an improvement over the current 10 years before that. So all of these trends will lead to higher technology deployment. And that higher technology deployment is not going to a world that emits more CO2, but it's going to a world that emits less CO2. So those are the main market reasons why I can wake up in the morning and feel optimistic that we're not moving backwards. The energy system will continue, perhaps not in an accelerated fashion, but it's not going to fall off a cliff and go back to years of uncontrolled pollution of all sorts. So the last point I want to make actually touches on Congress, and I'll do this quickly because we have certainly more of an expert on Congress than me sitting next to me here, which is just a meta-political observation. We look at the makeup of Washington, D.C. right now, and we see a Republican-controlled White House, legislative branch, House and Senate, as well as potentially a Supreme Court pick that could sway the Supreme Court. I just want to make a point that while Congress and the executive branch are controlled by one party, there are many different shades of red that exist within that party, making legislation actually very difficult. And it's a point that's really important to stress because there are many that are talking about the crown jewels of legislative activity for this Congress being invalidating the endangerment finding through legislative action. So essentially amending the Clean Air Act so that CO2 cannot be considered a pollutant and therefore will not trigger many of these regulations that, that they take issue with. Legislating things like that is very difficult. I just saw on my Twitter feed that Senator Rand Paul, a Republican from Kentucky, said that he would be opposed if President-elect Trump nominated Rudy Giuliani or John Bolton to be the Secretary of State. Now, why does that matter to this conversation? If one Republican opposes that nomination is not going to be able to get out of committee. So why the note of optimism maybe doesn't sound all that optimistic, but legislating is incredibly difficult. Governing is extremely difficult and requires a lot of thought, planning, and outreach. So I feel optimistic about the markets, and I feel optimistic that the government that we have set up and that we operate in has a lot of checks for very major changes. So I'll stop there and look forward to taking questions after.
I'm only standing up because I couldn't see this part of the room. I think those were two excellent presentations by Arvin and Sue, and I associate myself with everything they said. I spent a little more than 25 years in congressional hearings and markups, and one of the things that became clear to me after year 4 or 5, and something we used to say to each other, is that a markup or a hearing, everything that could be said was said, but not everyone had said it. So Sue and Arvin basically have said a lot of what I was thinking. So what I'm going to do is basically say exactly the same thing in a slightly different way. But it really goes to the strength of their fundamental points.
And Phil, people only remember 25%, so
Of what
it's
you
fine.
say, so repetition.
Well, there's a gap.
But I'll try to be relatively brief, but I'll try to frame it a different way. You all are climate experts and energy experts, and I'm guessing there aren't many screenwriters here. Fair? If you're a screenwriter, there's a pretty good formula you use. And that is you write with tension, there's a conflict, and at the end you resolve the conflict. If climate change were a movie, climate is the conflict, and the world is trying to deal with it. And one version of that movie would end with Paris. So the world comes together, it's got an approach going forward, not exactly clear it's going to be enough, or it's going to work, but that sets up a sequel. But we kind of have a resolution at the end. There's a technique in screenwriting, though, where you have a double ending. And you probably have seen movies like this. Usually they're action-adventure, where there's a conflict. It's usually two people, a hero or heroine, defeats the threat, starts walking away, and all of a sudden the threat pops up again. That's sort of where we are now, because we don't have a clear resolution. We don't know what the election means. We knew if Secretary Clinton won, what she wanted to do. It may not necessarily be bad that Donald Trump won because it's not specific enough yet, or it could be. We're going to find out. I've worked on and off on clean air issues for 30 years. And what strikes me, and this goes to Sue and Arvin's point, is the approach we've always taken in the Clean Air Act is technology forcing. So the government sets a standard that companies can't meet. We did this in the 1990 Clean Air Act. We set Tier 2 standards for automobiles. When we passed the law in 1990, there was no way the car companies could meet those standards. But we said, you have to figure out how to do it. And the car companies did. It was technology forcing. We may be in a different situation now. Instead of technology chasing standards, it may be that technology moves ahead and policy chases technology. And that's the point both Sue and Arvin were making. Now, there's a lot that a hostile administration could do to really slow us down on climate. They could ignore some of the existing policies. They could go slow. They could repeal them. They could affirmatively try to make things worse. There's one area they can't do that in, a hostile administration. And that's the billions of dollars we invested in 2009 in the stimulus. When Sue was talking about the explosion in renewable resources, you can see a lot of that from 2009. I think the numbers you were using went from 2000. I think from 2009, wind energy has almost tripled. I think solar energy is 200 times what it was in 2009. I think the cost of wind is down 70% from what it was in 2009. The cost of solar is over 80% down. The point Arvin was making on where industry is going, that's exactly right. Policy's not going to come in to stop that. That's just going to continue. And as Arvin was pointing out, people will get more creative. They'll be more efficient in their technologies. Sue pointed out states. There are a lot of state policies that will drive that same way. So federal policy may not be leading the charge, which would be the best thing for climate. But if it's not, it doesn't mean other things won't happen that's important. And I thought Arvin's point on the Clean Power Plant is especially apt there. So if we're thinking of this as a movie, we don't know what's going to happen now. We know a threat has popped up, but it might be industry comes to the rescue. It might be states come to the rescue. And maybe that the whole world says, it doesn't matter what happened. We're going to continue to go forward. There's another potential plot twist. And Arvin touched on this in the very end. I first went to Washington in 1981. And my first big challenge was working on the effort to essentially repeal the Clean Air Act in 1982. That was a very tough fight. If anybody here follows markups in Washington, especially today, they last a day or two. Our markup in 1982 lasted 6 months. And we eventually stopped the bill that would repeal the Clean Air Act. But Ronald Reagan came into office, you might remember this in 1979, saying trees create more air pollution than automobiles. By the time President Reagan was leaving office, notwithstanding the fact that one of his first initiatives was to roll back the Clean Air Act, as he was leaving office, we were putting the final touches on the Montreal Protocol. We were taking the first real steps to deal with ozone depletion. It's not the result you would have expected in the beginning. Republicans in 1994 had a contract with America where they wanted to roll back all regulations. And first on their priorities were environmental regulations. No one would have predicted that 1996, just 18 months after they were elected, we passed a strong Safe Drinking Water Act and a landmark pesticide law. It's hard to predict what's coming down the pike. And my experience is when people talk in campaigns, when they talk in ideology, what works there doesn't necessarily work when it comes to the hard questions of policy. Because you have to deal with reality. And I don't think anybody really questions the science on climate change. And I don't think either one of you really touched on the amount of jobs that are created through renewable energy. In a lot of those states, I couldn't quite see the map you put up where there's potential. That's job growth. So I understand why people could think they're in a bad movie right now because they thought it was going to have one ending and it's kind of switched. But I'm in the camp of it's not great, can't kid ourselves, but it may be okay. It may be because of all these trends in industry, in states, in innovation, in self-interest of the economy, that we're going to get to the relatively same place, just a different way. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all three of you. We have a good amount of time for questions, so I'm going to claim the first two myself, and I'll ask them together in case you want to address them together or in case you want to avoid one of them. So first, I'd like to ask if you could expand a bit on the potential for pushback from industry, from states, maybe from other groups, on attempts to roll back the Clean Power Plan or other federal regulation. And second, Phil was just talking about ways that in the past Congress has surprised us. If you had to speculate on one area where Congress or this administration might surprise us, energy efficiency legislation, something like that, what would it be? What potential do you see for that? And I address that to any and all of you.
Sure. So on your first question, which is essentially where will there be pushback on rollbacks of rules, I'll make a point that applies to an industry but not to specific members of that industry because the industry is so fragmented. But if you're an electric utility company, if you're the electric utility industry writ large, removing the Clean Power Plan actually causes a lot of uncertainty. Rolling back the Clean Power Plan, which by and large there was comfort around with the electricity generating industry, causes a lot of turmoil for the industry. So as this process moves forward, we'll be looking very closely to see how utilities themselves respond to this, because their world doesn't get easier to navigate with the underlying carbon obligation that I mentioned still existing, but not a pathway that they understand and they can comply with in place.
Arvin made the point that I was first going to make about the electric utility industry, and I'm distinguishing that portion of it at the moment. They really hate uncertainty, and they believe that natural gas prices are going to beat coal prices, and the delivered cost of electricity from those two resources are, so let's see, I already twisted my sentence around so much that I can't even tell where I'm supposed to end up. So they believe that they're not going to be investing in new coal plants. And coal plants' lives are becoming increasingly old and less efficient. So I think they think that the future, no matter what, is in natural gas and renewables. And then there are now so many people employed in clean energy, energy efficiency installers, solar installers, manufacturers, a variety of folks around the country in different places, that portion of the industry will push back. And I think as much as people apparently hate Washington, I think if people thought that somebody protecting their air resources were going to be taking that away, I think that there would be some pushback from a variety of different folks who otherwise never speak up on behalf of bureaucrats in Washington.
For me, is this going to be a situation where ideology and myth beats self-interest? So I think of 3 different states, New York, California, and Texas. I look at the just explosion of renewables in Texas. I think it's the fastest growing energy generation in the state. It's a lot of jobs. It makes economic sense in Texas. It's a reliable source of energy that they have there. It's a natural resource they could use just like they can use oil. So, and I've seen members sometimes vote ideology over self-interest. This one's just a little hard. And if Texas, California, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, Washington all have the same interest, then I think it gets a little trickier in a congressional fight to say, well, we have to affirmative. Let me put it this way. The only way I could see the progress being slowed is if Congress passes a bill and the new president signs a bill saying we can't proceed with renewable energy. That'd be the only way to do it. It'd have to be a prohibition. And it wouldn't be a free market. It would be stacking the deck against it some way. If that doesn't happen, the advantages are all with renewable energy right now. And so that's, in my mind, not so much a climate decision. It's just an economic and energy self-interest decision. So that's what I would look for.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience. I saw your hand go first.
How can we get those places in the center of the nation to take advantage of those renewable energy opportunities and geothermal and wind and walk away from the other uneconomic, non-job producing places where they're at right now?
So great question. Is there anybody here from Iowa? So Iowa has Iowa has tremendous wind resources. And Iowa regulators made a decision that for economic development purposes, they would pre-approve Warren Buffett's utility company's investment in wind resources and thereby eliminate some of the risk. That just unleashed the investment cycle in wind. Same is true in Texas, different reasons, different policies, different structure there. But there are a lot of those middle of the country states that really get it about unleashing their resources. Now, I mentioned one of the difficulties is going to be transmission. Wind is in the part of the country where there aren't a lot of people, and you can't just produce power unless people are taking it off the system. So if you're producing in a rural place, you got to move it to where people live. And if that's across state lines and the transmission system wasn't built for that, then you may need to add infrastructure. So let's see where they go on infrastructure, again, on transmission, because that could be one of the things that would help open up resources in the middle of the country. You guys may have different point of view on that.
No, I agree with that completely, and in some ways, I'd look at gay marriage. I know that has nothing to do with climate change, but look where gay marriage was in 2004 in the States. There are no votes in the Senate or the House to say gay marriage should be allowed and constitutional. Look at the sea change that's happened in the last 10, 12 years. Why did that happen in large part? It happened because big companies, some of them are Arvin's companies, said we're not going to do business in a state that discriminates. States started looking at it in their economic self-interest not to be regressive on that particular issue. And so you break through. There's also just a lag in information. I'll give you, this is off point, but it's one that's really fascinating to me. California is obviously a leader on wind and solar. California also has another renewable resource in geothermal. Most people would look at it, including experts in California, and say, well, geothermal doesn't make sense because it's more expensive than wind and solar to do, so we should put all our eggs in the wind and solar basket. A study was done recently to dig into that, and what it found is because geothermal runs all the time, we don't have to worry about ramping up and ramping down. And even though geothermal on its own is more expensive than wind and solar, if California were trying to do the best economic mix for ratepayers, it would be geothermal, wind, and solar because of the baseline power. I'm saying that because even for California, which is so progressive and leading into this, there's a lag time absorbing the information. And that's a good example of what's in the interest of ratepayers is the same interest for the economy of California.
I'm going to make one quick point on that. You brought up the Iowa example, and this is one that's kind of interesting to highlight. We did a job survey of advanced energy in Iowa, and the leading job category, the leading employment category in Iowa was not biofuels, it was not wind, it was energy efficiency. And the cognitive dissonance is that the vast majority of those jobs were in manufacturing of energy efficient appliances and things like that. The workers who participated, in these companies and in this industry would never consider themselves, or I don't know, I can't speak for every worker, but don't in general consider themselves part of the clean energy, advanced energy movement, whereas they are. And all of these, whether it's energy efficiency standards that Congress is considering or DOE is doing through its Energy Star program, those are all drivers of their employment. But there has been not great communication as to how directly linked energy efficiency jobs are with policy.
I'm going to let our director, Ricky, jump in.
Thanks. It's a question primarily for Sue. Sue, to what extent should we worry about the possibility the new administration will provide will try to open up the export of natural gas, and that will drive natural gas prices up in light of the much higher natural gas prices outside of the United States, and that the driving of natural gas prices up will make coal look comparatively better. And if that is a problem we should worry about, how many levers do we have as a community that would like to avoid that to try to stop those exports from happening?
That is a zinger question. And so a couple factoids, and I hope I'm going to get these right. The Obama administration has actually opened up the opportunity for exports of natural gas. You need a liquefaction facility on this side of an ocean in order to take natural gas, liquefy it, ship it across the ocean, and deliver it into another market. There have been a few of those already approved. Each one of them has been highly controversial from a siting point of view. They are under the jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from a siting point of view, and I think we'll hear maybe about that in the next panel. So I think that actually the economics so I do think that we will see some uplift in prices. The forward prices I showed actually reflect the market's expectation that there will be some exports. And then the question is whether or not, somehow we start licensing many, many more LNG facilities. I think that they're so capital intensive, they're so expensive, that you could expect to see a whole lot more permitted than actually are built. So I do think that it's the kind of thing where people rush to be the first one through the gates, and the others already have their horses revving up too, and then they start tapering off. So I do think we'll see some of it, some more exports. I think we will see some impact on prices. But what I know about the production process for natural gas, again, which is heavily driven by state promotional policies, even in a place like Oklahoma with earthquakes, it's still a constitutional issue that you can produce oil and gas. I do think that we are likely to see low prices because you can rev up production pretty fast on the natural gas side as long as fracking is allowed. Again, that's a state matter. And so as long as fracking is allowed, that production process for gas means that its incremental costs to come to the market are not that much higher. So I think we're likely to see leavening. Now, 8 years from now, you guys are going to just prove me wrong, I'm sure, because I don't get paid enough to know the answers to your questions. But that's how I would think about it. Thank you.
Let's go to this gentleman back here.
You've talked a lot about the opposition to big transmission lines and pipelines, and obviously bomb trains for environmental and safety reasons and all of that. But what about microgrids? Where does getting to a much local level, and micro's never really defined, fit into this picture?
God, I just keep saying great questions, great questions. So all of the above, I think. Microgrids are of high interest in a lot of communities. They enable an islanding of a portion of a distribution system. So let's say Hurricane Sandy or the equivalent hits, the grid goes out and you have some critical services that are served by local generation facilities. They can be either oil, they can be natural gas fired, they can be a combination of solar, combined heat and power, and a variety of things. So you've got them locally, and then they can make sure that people are getting their medical services when needed. I think we are going to see continued development of that. Tons of interest around the country for a lot of different reasons, including resiliency of the grid in a time of cybersecurity, in a time of changing climate. So I think that happens in parallel with going after very high value resources, natural resources that produce renewable energy. And you don't find that in the middle of New York City. Microgrids in the middle of New York City are very cool. And Con Edison is doing is somebody here from Con Ed? I thought I saw somebody. They're doing, oh, hello. They're doing a variety of cool projects to reinforce their local grid with the kinds of small-scale resources that we're talking about. And so there's a lot of that happening at the same time of talking about the big system.
Let's go up front here sorry, he had his hand up first.
Yeah, I guess the question here is, you said all the advantages are with renewable energy. Now, I think first, I'd just like to correct a word there, that I think it's not so much renewable energy, but rather renewable electricity. A tremendous amount of our energy is actually fossil fuels, which are burned either in vehicles or in buildings for heat, okay? Also, when so I think it'd be good if we focus on the fact that it is renewable electricity we're talking about, not renewable energy. But even in the renewable electricity sector, we know that the tax credits and preferred 5-year depreciation benefits for small wind, for fuel cells, and for combined heat and power are going away on December 31st and undoubtedly will not be renewed by the Republicans. In addition, on the heating side, the tax credits for ground source heat pumps are also going away at the end of December 31st. So the only thing that really is continuing or has positive things looking at it is renewable electricity, and then only in the large wind and solar sectors. The rest of the renewable energy business is essentially going to be cratered at the end of December when all the tax credits go away. Can you guys say anything about that larger issue of renewable energy, which includes fossil fuels burned for transportation and for heating, which is in New York State? If I could just quickly say this, in New York State, only 18% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from electrical production and all of the use of electricity, okay? 35% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels built in either residential or commercial buildings. 40% of our emissions come from fossil fuels built in transportation. So 75% of our greenhouse gas emissions in this state have nothing to do with electricity. It's vehicles and it's buildings. So in this state, and Connecticut's the same way, electricity just isn't that important. It's only 18%. I think in Connecticut it's like 20%, okay? What do we do about renewable energy in a state like ours where essentially all federal support for the things that are most important to us, which are not the electricity side, are going away?
You want to start? Or you want me to?
Sorry for a long question.
So this is the subject of many more hours than we have right now. It's ironic that New York is spending so much time in its reforming the energy vision on the electric sector, in part because they believe that over time the electric sector will eat into markets that are now supplied by oil, propane, natural gas, in industry, in electric vehicles, in buildings. So I think there's a portion of not only New York's agenda, but also the agenda in a lot of parts of the country to decarbonize electricity and use that to help decarbonize the other thing. But you're absolutely right that when we're talking about a plan for the electric grid, that's so much more advanced than a plan for the building stock in older parts of the country. I mean, parts of the country with old building stock like where we are right now, and in industries. So New York doesn't have the same kind of heavy industry as other parts of the country that is also not electrified. That is fossil energy. So yes, this is the important tip of the iceberg, and forgive us, we talked about the Clean Power Plan because that's about the electric sector. So in fact, we kind of used maybe inappropriate blinders to think about it that way. But you're absolutely right. Those things are important leading edge areas of the economy. Energy efficiency ends up being the premier thing to address in every one of those, including vehicles. I mean, the fuel economy standards, I don't think they're going to take away. And the the appliance efficiency standards, I would be shocked if they go away because every one of those has been adopted by a Republican Congress, if I'm thinking about it right. So I think there are still levers to be pulled, but way more levers to have to pull in those other areas.
What I'd add to that, the disagreement I'd have with you, you're correct on the terminology, but I don't look at this as static. And I've seen this in too many other areas where industries will project, not in an environmental setting, but they'll project out what they think the future is going to be 4 or 5 years from now, and they're just absolutely wrong. So even with some of the tax advantages going away, I think the power of innovation and the interest of companies to be clean companies goes beyond just the electricity. I think it seeps into a lot of other areas, and I think cost efficiencies will continue.
Arvin, did you want to? Okay. I see all the hands in the center. I just want to make sure we're not missing people on the periphery in the back there.
The center of the country is very active here.
Thank you. I guess I was struck by sort of the combination of Arvin and Susan's sort of invocation of competitive forces as sort of riding to the rescue for clean energy. And so that image of Arvin's chart that shows sort of diminishing returns for CapEx in the transmission sector and the utility sector being sort of a sign of kind of constrained private activity. I mean, I think someone could just as easily look at a chart like that and say that that is potentially the result of, concentrated, vertically reintegrated market for, Exelon and their like sort of being able not to, being able to extract more rent for, a given dollar of CapEx. Similarly, Sue's point about natural gas doing the virtuous work of beating out coal. I mean, it's getting to the point where they're now beating out nukes, which is a lot more problematic. And also there seems to be this massive unregulated upstream emissions problem with methane associated with natural gas, which I don't think is promulgated into a rule yet. So, I guess I would just ask whether, and understanding that optimism is the watchword here, whether there is sort of a certain critical tempering of those market forces that need to happen to make it actually sort of do the work we're hoping it will, that will in fact sort of is at risk of falling off in both those cases.
Go ahead.
So a couple things. I do think that the EPA methane rule is totally at risk. It's not as far along as the Clean Power Plan, so I would expect that to fall. I agree with you that methane associated with production of natural gas is definitely a problem.
It's actually in the oil gas industry's benefit to fix those leaks, and then they can sell the gas and make a profit.
To a point. Were that entirely true, which I believe in principle, we would not be having methane leaks. So yes, I agree with you that that has value.
It's a 1-year payback period, 100%.
So how come we have methane leaks if
Because
you're
they're
right?
lazy.
Okay, it's amazing. That's great. Okay, on nukes. I was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying that we really do need to keep nukes in the mix. But I would have rather seen New York do it in a way that was technology neutral and concerned with carbon emissions, not choice of technology and being preferred. So there are ways to design policy that are market friendly, and some of our friends here, like me and Paul, we would encourage that to happen everywhere that you could, rather than picking winners and losers. But I think if we don't keep the nukes in place, we're really toast.
Just one quick comment there. I agree with much of what you're saying, but optimism is the key word today. Specifically on competitive markets issues, one area of optimism that I see, right, 70% of electricity consumers are in organized electricity markets specifically. We have seen now not only FERC start to take some action in recognizing that there's technologies largely being blocked out of various markets, but I'll also say politically, there is a realignment of supporters of various types of advanced energy technologies, including storage, in a way that I think has a potential to fundamentally change how these organized markets function and how technologies are able to unlock other technologies to compete in these markets. So your points are all well taken, but I think the trend line is pointing towards more competition in organized markets.
Up front here.
Yeah,
I'd like to return to your comment, Susan, about the difficulty of transmission lines. And hook that up to what Bob Wyman said. Bob is telling us, excuse me, Bob is telling us that in New York State and elsewhere, the biggest challenges will be in electric vehicles, electrified transportation, and in heating. Now, I suspect that photovoltaic panels on the roof will never be large enough to handle the loads of large loads like electric vehicles, space heating, or air conditioning. So you'd have to bring it in perhaps with transmission lines, but as you point out, the transmission lines are difficult. So what I see separate little pieces and hopes, but I haven't seen an integrated plan that sweeps across all the different end uses, all the sources, and integrates them in some kind of logical way that might result in a low-carbon future. It's very piecemeal from my perception. Thank you.
You know, I've been involved in energy policy and environmental policy for 30 years. And if there's one reality that I think is true in the United States is we will never have an integrated energy policy. Our energy policy is a function of state action. So there may be, at best, 50 energy policies. Even within states, most of the investment is done in private markets so that the actions are one-off things that come out of legislative bargains, one-off net energy metering policy, one-off building efficiency things. It isn't, politically, we are not organized to have comprehensive energy laws for the most part, and there's nobody who's willing to sustain the action on energy policy. So if one piece of bad news, whether we would have had a Clinton or Trump administration, we are never going to have a national energy policy that's comprehensive. So do we then have a number of things that really improve on getting private decisions done? Could be a carbon tax, could be other things in addition to a variety of things, but I don't think in my lifetime we'll see a comprehensive energy policy.
Well, if I may respond to that.
Yeah.
I think if you do a study of the carbon tax and look at how much money it would take to do a low-carbon future, I think you'll very quickly convince yourself that carbon tax cannot provide the money to make the transition.
I agree with you.
Way too small.
I agree.
If that's the case, where are the policies to generate the additional trillions of dollars which you will need for a carbon tax because you need it right now?
Innovation.
Yeah.
Where's the money going to come from?
And Congress has considered some of these approaches over the past 5 years, and whether it's the Warner-Lieberman in 2007, Waxman-Markey in 2010. I mean, you're asking a good question that I don't think we have answers to. I'll leave it at that, unless Phil does.
Well, again, I'd go back to something I was alluding to before. I don't think we had the answer to that in the early 90s on telecommunications. When we were looking at trying to figure out how to develop a new telecommunication system, the answers weren't all up front. There was investment, significant investment that had to get made, and then you learn as you go. I think Sue's right that it's hard to set out a national energy policy right up front. But I'm in a different place than I think where you are, because I look at tremendous changes that have happened in the last 10 years. I don't think that's the end of it.
I would hope not, but let's be fair. Right now, nationally, solar energy only produces 1% of our electricity.
Right.
That's
So-
right.
And I keep hearing about 2050. 2050 gets closer by the hour. So even though you've made a lot of advancements, the real question is, are you moving fast enough? What do you have to do additionally? Where are you going to get the money? How does it all get integrated? You don't have a plan? Give me an imperfect plan.
Totally agree with everything you're saying. The urgency is so compelling, and yet we live in a world in which people are voting on other things besides
Yeah,
this.
but-
That is a practical reality.
But I'll reserve my right to dissent on it. Again, it's just based on personal experience. I worked in the 1980s on acid rain. Sometimes when we were working on acid rain, people said exactly the same thing. How are you going to make any progress on this when we're losing so much time? The same exact thing was said on ozone depletion. So we've seen tough issues. We've seen almost intractable issues make real progress. That's no guarantee now, especially under the current circumstances. But you can see a path forward, and that's the key thing.
But we have,
Yes.
We're going as fast as circumstances will allow.
we have a panel coming up next on electricity and energy policy. So
They'll
we
have
can-
the answer to
They'll
the
answer
question.
We can continue this discussion, but I want to take one or two more questions before the end here.
There's
We'll
some
go
ones over
there
there.
and then up front here to.
Yeah, my question is about the burgeoning natural gas industry. I personally have been aware of the danger of earthquakes with fracking for some time. It's been in the news quite a bit more in the past week or two. Is that going to halt this industry? Are there any techno fixes that exist with respect to the disposal of the water to prevent these kind of complications? Those are my two questions, actually.
Well, as you undoubtedly know, the industry's practices vary by geology across the states and as a matter of state regulation and policy. The South, it happens to be a place where they've used water injection of the water that's used that comes out of the earth when you're drilling for gas and it's pulled out, that's injected back into the earth. That is not done everywhere in the country, maybe for better or worse in some circumstances, depending upon the geology. So I don't know what Oklahoma will do besides put a halt on, and Arkansas, maybe Tennessee too, to put a halt on figuring out what they're going to do. But certainly, deep water injection is not allowed in some states. That then has a surface water problem that has to be addressed. So it's not an uncomplicated problem. And the ability of the industry to retain its license to operate in the various states could get more complicated. And that would certainly change the price forecast that I showed up there.
Yes, up front here.
Do any of you have anything to say about what happened in Nevada with solar and utilities intentionally sabotaging it?
I don't know.
So I'm assuming, the question was, do we know anything about Nevada and the utilities sabotaging the solar industry? I would say it differently. Right now, there is a rate-making policy in most of the states that if you have solar energy on your roof, like I do in Colorado, my meter runs reverse. So for every kilowatt hour that's produced on my roof, I get to subtract one from my electricity bill. And right now, a significant portion of a utility's costs to run the grid are collected through usage fees. That's a reality. So that if that design of a rate continues, you have kind of a spiral of not collecting enough money to keep the grid operating. So it's got to be fixed. They made a really bad decision in Nevada to ungrandfather everybody's rooftop investments. That was a political decision, I think, about how fast to do this, and it was huge backlash. But that does not eliminate the underlying challenge, which it is not, in my personal view, it is not a sustainable model to have increasing numbers of people go off system and use it for backup supply, the grid, for backup supply, and to take their power when they're over-consuming and not pick up the cost of that. So it's got to be something that people are addressing, but that was a dumb choice.
I'll just make one Nevada from Massachusetts. One point there, and this goes back to some of the utility issues that we talked about early on. Essentially, one of the major casinos, and I'm forgetting the name of it, I think it's the Mirage, or I don't.
Maybe Trump.
Wanted to procure their own electricity, and they wanted their own electricity to come from renewable sectors. Now that poses a major problem with the contract between utilities and their consumers in Nevada, and what ended up happening, the casino ended up paying a really large disconnect fee to be able to procure their own electricity the way they want it. So Nevada is actually an example of how some of these forces in the market are actually coming to bear. Huge natural resource of solar energy there, and also major consumers wanting it. It's actually ground zero for a lot of these fights.
A third of the country that would have been allowed. And in 2/3 of the country, you can't buy from somebody besides your local utility.
I'm going to continue to be upbeat. The thing I'd say is I'd look less at Nevada and more at California. I'd look at the legislation California just passed and where California's going, and I'd say that's a template for the rest of the country.
And I would agree with you about Texas, too. I mean, some of my favorite Republican friends in the industry are right when they say that there is a lot going very well in the Texas electricity industry.
Okay, we'll leave it there. We'll take a short break and come back at 2:15. Please join me in thanking the panelists.